Grim greetings, my friends, and welcome to Spooky, Scary Skeletales. Today we have a pair of short stories written by John Allen. The first, Johnny Takes a Dare, followed by The Open Window, which is John Allen's adaptation of a story by Saki. Let's begin. Johnny Takes a Dare. The best thing about the new house they were building down by the woods at the other end of town was that there wasn't any watchman. Do you know how cool it is to play in a house that's being built? All that sand and all those wooden beams over the cellar that you can walk tightrope on? The kind of playing that it's probably a good thing parents didn't know anything about, because if they did, they'd have a fit. Well, it all happened on a Saturday in the summertime, the time of year when you have dinner and still have a few hours of daylight left to play in. Johnny, a husky 10-year-old, and his pals were playing King of the Hill on the sand pile by the new house, and Johnny was doing a pretty good job of being the king. As they wrestled up and down, the sun slowly set through the trees and cast long, shadowy fingers across the unfinished house and the great piles of unused lumber. The darker it got, the brighter glowed the red warning lantern which the workmen had left behind, until finally everything was bathed in an eerie red glow. Finally the game stopped, and the boys, breathing heavily, looked about them. "Gee, it's scary, isn't it?" one of the boys said with wide eyes. "Nothing to be scared of," said Johnny, who liked to think he wasn't scared of anything. One of the boys whispered, "Gee, fellas, I think I'll just head on home." "Oh, yeah," whispered another boy. I'll bet you get out of here just as fast as we do." Johnny yawned and stretched. "I don't know, fellas. Maybe I'll just spend the night here." The whispering boy said, "Go on. I just dare you to." "What do you give me if I do?" said Johnny, who liked to take dares to show how brave he was. "My new scout knife," whispered the boy as he edged toward the road home. "Sure," said Johnny. "Like taking candy from a baby. Hey, drop off and tell my folks I'm camping out for the night." Johnny looked around and started for the unfinished house. He was startled for a moment as he saw a great shadow moving against the side of it, but laughed weakly to himself as he realized it was his own shadow caused by the red lantern light. One room was almost finished. At least it had a floor and a roof on. "Good a place as any," said Johnny to himself as he found a clear place on the floor and settled down. The wind blew crisply through the open doors and windows. It was just a sliver of a moon, but it was quickly covered by a swift-moving cloud. Soon there was no light at all but the red lantern's glow against the opposite wall. After a while, Johnny thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, because the red lantern light seemed to be getting dimmer and dimmer. What was that? He heard the sound of scratching from the next room. It got louder and louder. Then, around the corner scurried a squirrel. said Johnny, half to himself. The squirrel looked at Johnny and almost grinned. At least Johnny thought he did. And he settled back again. What was that? Scratching again, louder this time. Then he saw a shadow move slowly into the doorway. It was another squirrel, but it was as big as a cat. Johnny pretended to be asleep. The big squirrel pattered over to the little one and spoke to him. Hello there, Henry. Well, what are we going to do with him? Good evening, Clarence. We'll wait until Charlie comes, said the little squirrel. and they both turned and grinned in Johnny's direction. Through half-closed eyes, Johnny thought their teeth were awfully long, and that he didn't care so much about that new scout knife. A few moments later, there was some more scratching, pretty loud this time, and in the door came a squirrel as big as a sheepdog. He shuffled over to the others and nodded in greeting. "Henry, Clarence, what'll we do with him?" Henry piped up. "Like I told Clarence here, George, I'll wait until Charlie comes." George nodded and grinned at Johnny, who was beginning to have some doubts about this whole adventure. He was beginning to wish he was home in his own bed when he heard a heavy noise, and in through the door came a squirrel as big as a good-sized pony. His bushy tail brushed the top of the doorway as he entered. He lumbered over to the other three and sat up, and his head almost touched the ceiling. He said, "Hello, Clarence, George. Oh, I didn't see you there, Henry. Well, what are we going to do with him?" The other three said, "Hello, Cecil. Wait till Charlie comes." Then they all turned towards Johnny, but before they could grin at him, Johnny leaped to his feet, and as he ran wildly out the door, he shouted, "Tell Charlie I couldn't wait!" The Open Window. Mr. Nuttall was a very nervous man. He had been undergoing treatment for several years now, and as he had an independent income and no need to work, he spent a great deal of time in visits to friends and relatives. Before his nervous condition had come about, he had been an almost total recluse, spending a great deal of his time raising mushrooms in his damp cellar and reading a large number of books. As a consequence, his visits to sea relations consisted of meeting a large group of comparative strangers. It was in the early fall of the year when he knocked on the door of the Sappleton residence. He was ushered in by a very dignified 10-year-old girl who asked him to have a seat and told him that her aunt would be down shortly. She sat for a moment, glancing at a large, strangely bound book, then looked up at Mr. Nuttall. "Do you know many of the people around here?" she asked. "Hardly a soul," said Mr. Nuttall. "Then you know practically nothing about my aunt," said the girl. Mr. Nuttall admitted he knew only her name and her address. "Ah," the young girl smiled sympathetically. "Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago." "Tragedy?" inquired the nervous Mr. Nuttall. The girl pointed to the French windows leading to the lawn. "You may wonder why we keep that window open in the fall of the year." "Well, it is quite warm for this time of the year," said Mr. Nuttall, shifting slightly in his chair. "But has that window got anything to do with the tragedy?" The girl then told him this story. Out through that window 3 years ago, this very day, her husband and her 2 younger brothers went off for a day's hunting in the woods you can see there. They never came back. In crossing the swamps to their favorite piece of hunting ground, all of them were engulfed in a treacherous piece of quicksand. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it. My poor aunt thinks they will all come back someday, they and the little brown dog that was lost with them, and walk in that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening till night falls. Poor dear aunt, she has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white raincoat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing as he always did to tease her because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know that sometimes, on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get the creepy feeling that they will walk through that window? Mr. Nuttall shuddered, and was relieved when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. I hope Vera has been amusing you, she said. She's been very interesting, said Mr. Nuttall, glancing in the direction of the open window. The long shadows of the late afternoon made the distant trees even gloomier, he thought. I do hope you don't mind the open window, said the aunt in a brisk voice. My husband and brothers will be home shortly from hunting, and they always come in this way. They've been out on the marshland today, so they'll make a fine mess on my poor carpets. She prattled on cheerfully about the hunting and the scarcity of birds and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Mr. Nuttall, it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but not too successful attempt to turn the talk to a less ghastly topic, but he was conscious that his hostess was not giving him a great deal of her attention. Her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window. He thought it was an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. He cleared his throat nervously and tried once more to capture the attention of his hostess. The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement, and the avoidance of anything in the way of physical exercise. On the matter of diet, they are not so much in agreement. No, said the aunt. Then suddenly she brightened into alert attention. Here they are at last, and just in time for tea. Don't they look as if they're muddy up to the eyes? Mr. Nuttall shivered slightly and turned toward the little girl to give her a smile of sympathy. The child was staring out through the open window with a dazed horror in her eyes. In the chill shock of nameless fear, Mr. Nuttall swung around and looked in the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn toward the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them carried a muddy white raincoat. A tired brown spaniel was close at their heels. Noiselessly they neared the house. Then Mr. Nuttall heard, "Do you ken John Peel in his coat of grey? Do you ken John Peel at the break of day with the fox and the hounds in the morning?" Good heavens! Just as the little girl had said, one of the men was singing. Mr. Nuttall grabbed wildly for his hat and coat and dove for the front door. Flinging it open, he ran down the path, tried to jump the hedges, tripped and fell down. He picked himself up and with one terrified look back at the house, ran down the road towards the railroad station. Back in the house, the figure carrying the muddy white raincoat stepped in the open window and said, "Well, we're home, dear. A bit muddy, but on time for supper. Who was that ran out as we came up to the house?" "That was a Mr. Nuttall, dear," said the aunt. "Some distant relative who dropped in for a visit. Extraordinary man. All he seemed to talk about was his illness, and when he saw you coming, dashed off without saying a word. I don't know what to make of it." The little girl shook her head gravely and said, "I expect it was the spaniel. Mr. Nuttall has a horror of dogs. He was just telling me before you came down that once he was chased into a cemetery by a pack of wild dogs and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave, with the creatures snarling and grinning and foaming just above him." "Oh, why, the poor man," said her aunt. "One would have thought he had seen a ghost." The little girl smiled sweetly. We hope you enjoyed today's pair of shivery little stories. Please join us again next week for more spooky, scary Skeletales. Until we meet again, farewell.